What I'm doing tonight is a little bit different than what I would normally do when I do a full-blown church consultation, because the assignment you've given to me is different, but there will be some material that I will be using when I work with a church in a consultation. And I have found that often when I get done, if the church says, this is what we want to do, this is where we want to go, this is what we want to buy into, that having it recorded then allows more and more leaders to look and buy into the process and see what's happening. So that's why I've asked them to record. I want to begin tonight sharing just a little bit of my background with you, because my background determines how I work with churches today. So even though I'm going to start when I was age 5, it's not going to take that long, so don't worry about it at this point. When I was age 5, my 2 older brothers, the nearest brother was a senior in high school, my other brother was in college, and I was 5 years of age. Both came to a relationship with God through Jesus Christ the same week. And in our little farming community in New Jersey, it just turned things upside down. And I knew, because I wanted to follow my brothers, that both of them ended up going to seminary, ended up being missionaries, that I wanted to go to seminary, and all I knew was I wanted to be a preacher. And I'd come home from church, get the piano stool out, put the Bible down and preach, and everybody would leave the living room, because who wants to hear some 5-year-old holler? I mean, that was my idea of preaching. So when I went to Bible college, I went to Philadelphia College of Bible. I went to Bible college to get to seminary. Graduated from seminary in 1970, so I have now been ordained for 50 years, because I'm old. If you don't believe, when I'm at the beach, you just count the rings on my stomach and you can tell how old I am at that point. I pastored my first church in Trenton, New Jersey. I was too naive to realize that seminary does not teach you how to lead a church, and it does not teach you about leadership. It teaches you about theology, it teaches you about Bible, it teaches maybe how to preach, but it really doesn't teach about the church. And I realized that what I had learned about the church, and I went to an evangelical seminary, not even a mainline seminary, they really had no idea of the church. In fact, the biggest problem we've had in the last century in our seminaries is they really have no understanding of the church, which is in part why I believe since as I said on Sunday, the last 50 years, the church has gone into decline. And where there used to be 500,000, there's now 320,000. And most churches are like yours. You're in plateau or decline. This church has bounced around between 300 and 400, while the community is just mushrooming. It's because we really don't understand the church. So for 3 years I was there. We grew maybe from 140 to about 170, but nothing to write home about. So then I went to Denver and taught for 10 years at a Bible college, because that way I could pontificate about the church and be dogmatic about the church, but I didn't have to mess with it. Although I preach there every Sunday to make a living, because they don't pay a lot of money when you're teaching at a Bible college. After 10 years of doing that, I got involved in a church in Denver where I finally learned what the church should be and what the church should do. And I really learned that from a mentor pastor. Our church, I was there for 11 years, had 1 acre of land, 56 parking places, and we got to 1,400 people on a weekend in 11 services. So when I read from your material that we're 2 churches and we can't know each other and can't do anything, I just laugh. Because we all knew we were a church. And I'm going to talk about what makes a church, no matter how many congregations you have. And by the way, if you had a congregation that you could put 1,000 people in the room at the same time, nobody there, other than maybe the staff, would know more than 200 people. That's all you can know for the most part. So I began to learn about the church and what the church was about. Our vision was to exist to change the city of Denver. And we not only had congregations and people growing, the church I was a co-pastor. When the pastor went there, it was 50 people. When we left 20 years later, it was 1,400 people on a weekend. But we had 35 ministries, all run by laity throughout the city of Denver. street school, unwed mothers. Some of you have heard of MOPS. One of the ladies in our church helped start MOPS. Jail ministries. We actually had a street school where you got a high school diploma. We then had a business where kids got work experience. And then we actually would help them get jobs. And just working and changing the city. By the way, when the other pastor and I left at the end of 20 years, after the 20-year reign that pastor had, I was there half the time. About 5 years later, Columbine occurred in Denver, which most Americans don't forget Columbine because that was kind of the first school massacre that we've had. 5 years later, I was traveling back through Denver and I was in the United Club reading the Denver Post, the Sunday edition. And the whole front page of the living section and the whole back page of the living section, written by a reporter from the Denver Post who, as far as I could tell, had no Christian axe to grind, talked about how 20 churches had ministered effectively to the Columbine community and that the community had survived in ways they never expected because of the ministries of those churches. It was interesting when they listed the churches, 18 of them were part of a network we had started called Mile High Ministries to minister to the city of Denver. And the day came when the city of Denver said, if it hadn't been for your church, we would be far worse off as a city. And in a sense, that was our vision, to say the day has to come when the city says your church is important. I left there to go teach at Denver Seminary, eventually became executive vice president and academic dean, and then Leith Anderson and I, who's recently just retired as the head of National Association of Evangelicals, we created an organization called Teaching Church Network. 1997, our grant ran out and I had to find a ministry. I moved to California to work with what you would call a presbytery of churches. It was 220 American Baptist churches. Now, most of these churches back in the 50s and 60s and 70s had been churches of 300, 500, 1,000, good-sized churches. But they were declining, and when we got there, the average worship attendance in all 220 churches on a Sunday was 100 people. Now, you think about that. That's not a big number. And I would walk into churches that used to be 300, 500, 700, and there'd be 50 or 60 people. The average age would be 70. They had no children, no teenagers. And the vision of most of those churches was they hoped the church would remain viable, that when the older people died, they could be buried there. I reminded them that's not a great vision. I mean, minimally it takes 4 to carry a coffin. So somebody's going to have to turn out the lights. You know, who's it going to be? And in 5 years, God did a miracle because only God grows the church. Now, some of you are shaking your head in agreement. If that's true, then you have to wrestle with, why hasn't Bethel been growing? Can God not find Cornelius? Okay, does God not like Presbyterians? I mean, why is the church growing? Well, the Apostle Paul, in that passage where he says God grows the church, also says that we are to be wise master builders. And in 5 years, we went from 37 out of the 220 churches growing to over 150 of those churches growing. And much of that growth were new people coming to Jesus. So our churches weren't growing by rearranging sheep, where they leave this church to go to that church. They were growing, if I could use a biblical metaphor, of turning goats into sheep. And the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about tonight and tomorrow night is what does it take to be wise master builders in God's church. And because of that, and some books I was asked to write, since 2012, when I stepped down from my day job, I have not used the R word. I have not retired. I'm 76. This is how I play golf. I've been working with churches all across the country, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Cuba, Jamaica, and we're seeing God do the same thing with church after church after church. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I began working with ECO. And I will tell you, one of the first group of churches we work with were up in Western Pennsylvania. I've come to learn that Western Pennsylvania is simply Alabama without the accent. Okay, I mean, it's almost all the pastors literally carried on Sunday because you never knew what might happen. And one of the churches there was Middle Presbyterian Church, so you can check out their website if you don't believe me. Church was started in 1772. The first ordained pastor to cross the Alleghenies was the pastor who started that church in 1772. He was on one horse with one girl in front and one girl in the back. His wife was on a horse with one girl in the front and one girl in the back, and they crossed the Alleghenies and started that church. In the 1950s, that church, they said when they would do Vacation Bible School, the pastor would have to move out of the manse because they had to use all the room because they had kids and people coming. And I mean, a little building, a little footprint. Church was still then running about 200. When we got there to work with that church, it's now an ECO church, there were 35 people. Average age was probably 75. I think there was one child and one teenager. And we came in to work with the congregation. Now, here was the problem. Half the congregation wanted this to be historical landmark. They did not care one iota about growth. They wanted to keep things the same. They wanted to keep things just as they were. And the other half, now when you got 35 people, that's not many people, wanted to see the church reach the community. And in 1 year, the pastor told me, she said, Paul, I got up on a Sunday morning. She'd been there 5 years. She's 65. She said, I looked out and realized we had 65 people sitting in church, which is even more amazing to realize that 15 of the people who wanted the church to be a historical landmark had left. I mean, that's amazing growth. People are coming to Christ. They have children. They actually have a youth program because they have become wise master builders in God's church. So I'm here tonight and tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to give you my report. Tonight I want to talk about some things about the church and some things that I'm convinced churches need to deal with and think about in order to find out what it means to be a wise master builder of a church. So, Tom, if you'll help me on one side, and you want to hand out some of these handouts? I want to go through these handouts. I'm going to stop every so often for questions, but if you have questions at any time, feel free to interrupt. I mean, I've been interviewing Presbyterians now for 3 days, and none of them felt bad about interrupting, so, feel free to interrupt. And
Is that all?
Tom's got some extra thing. Okay. All right, I want to talk first of all about the nature and the purpose of the church. And this first paragraph is literally a quote out of ECO's The Congregation, Nature and Purpose of the Church, ECO Polity 2018. So the denomination you have joined says this is the nature and purpose of the church. So let me read it. Congregations exist in a variety of forms, yet have these ends in common: sharing the good news of reconciliation to God in and through Jesus Christ. So that's one purpose. Gathering people for divine worship and nurturing relationships for spiritual accountability and mutual ministry. That's the second purpose. All while making disciples to be sent people of God into this world. Now, I want to unpack that for a minute. Most churches that I've talked to, and I've worked now with about 35 to 40 ECO congregations, they all said they joined ECO because they realized that PCUSA, for the most part, was spiritually bankrupt. And when I asked them, how do you know that? And they said, well, and here I hear this all the time, they promote homosexuality, they are for abortion, and they list some of those social issues that have become lightning rods in our community. But ECO has addressed another theological position that most churches in the United States have missed because the seminaries have never taught it. I've been highly impressed with everything I've learned about Dee Dee. I've learned about Rob. I've learned about Bill Cain. And whether you rate those as good pastors, great pastors, awesome pastors, they all believed what I believed when I got out of Bible college and did not understand the nature of the church. And so let me unpack those three purposes. You will notice that sharing the good news of reconciliation to God in and through Jesus Christ. That is a real fancy theological way of saying they do the Great Commission. They make sure people know that life apart from Jesus Christ means you don't get to God, and that there is an eternal difference made whether you believe in Jesus Christ or whether you do not believe in Jesus Christ. The second piece is gathering people for divine worship and nurturing relationships for spiritual accountability and mutual ministry. This is what most churches do. This is what your church has done from at least the beginning, probably before, but I didn't read any history before, from the beginning of Dee Dee all the way through Rob and through Bill and through interims, was to say, we are here to help the Christians worship. We are here to help the Christians mature. Now, many churches find it difficult to have real spiritual accountability, where people really live in an accountability relationships with one another, but that's what they're working on, and mutual ministry. The third purpose most churches do not do, all while making disciples to be sent people of God in this world, to go out and reproduce. So for me, a disciple of Jesus Christ is somebody who comes and says, I want to believe in Jesus. That's the initial part of becoming a disciple. The second part of becoming a disciple is then learning what that means, learning about prayer, learning about worship, learning about Bible study, learning about loving your neighbor, learning all those teachings of the Bible. And then the third part is actually going out and making more disciples for Jesus Christ. I find in Christian circles, we often talk about maturity. I've come to realize that in most of our human experience, we define maturity by how you develop physically. And so we say when a teenager goes through puberty, they are in the process of maturing physically. Now, no teenager is mature. You know that and I know that because we've all been one. But they're moving toward physical maturity because they can now reproduce. The interesting thing is we don't believe that in the church. We believe that maturity comes with tenure. I've been a Presbyterian for 40 years. I've been on session 5 times. I've been in a Bible study for 25 years. I would argue, folks, if I've been in a Bible study for 25 years and I haven't helped reproduce a new Christian, I'm not mature, I'm constipated. Because all I've done is taken in and taken in and taken in and taken in. So, the denomination you belong to is trying to rectify what has been a major theological faux pas in our Christian world. because most Christians believe the church is for them. And it's not. It's for the Christians to be mobilized to reproduce and make more Christians. So, Bethel Presbyterian mission statement. Serving people to ignite a lifelong passion for Jesus Christ. This is your mission frame, and this is the mission statement you've adopted. Good mission statement. But there's one question you have to ask from my perspective, and that is, what do we mean by people? Your congregation, I believe, like all congregations, serves two kinds of people. Those who are already disciples of Jesus Christ and those who are not. So the question is, which of these two groups gets priority? Okay? Now, by the way, how you answer that question determines whether you grow or whether you don't grow. Okay? Let's suppose that it's post-COVID time, and everybody's back at church, and you have a combined service in this room, and everybody's packed in, and we don't mind being packed in because we can now breathe on each other. Okay. And I'm up in front of the church, and I say to the people of your church, call out all the ministries your church does. Well, we're preaching, we pray, we have committees, we have session, we have deacon, we have choir, we have worship team, we go to the rescue mission, we're Presbyterian, so we eat, we do all this stuff. And I'm writing on a dry erase board all the stuff, bigger board, because you do a lot of stuff. Finally, after about a half hour, nobody can think of anything else. Even the compulsives are exhausted. And so I look at the congregation, and I say, this is all the stuff you do. I said, yeah, that's it. I said, all right, I just want to ask one question. Why? Why do you do all this stuff? Because whatever your answer is, that's your mission. It's why you exist. Okay? Now, I've suggested to churches, in reality, there's only about 3 possible answers. Okay? First answer is most of the stuff we do up here is for us. Why do we do a traditional service? Because a bunch of people want it. Why do we do Worship Cafe? Because a bunch of people want it. Why do we have children's ministry? Because a bunch of people have kids and they want it. Why do we do youth ministry? Because a bunch of people have teenagers and they want it. Why do we have groups? Why do we do it? Now, because we're evangelical, we'll do a lot of great commandment stuff. We'll go to the rescue mission, we'll feed people, we'll do all kinds of things. We'll send money to missionaries overseas, hoping that they will do the Great Commission. We're willing to pay spiritual hit people to go do it. But most churches don't do it. In fact, if you run out of money, it's those other things that often get cut so we can still do worship, we can still do these things because we want it for us. And I'm convinced the reason why 80% to 85% of all churches in the United States are in plateau or decline is because the church is run for the people who are there. I mean, even Drucker said, the day any organization is run for its members is the day that organization begins to die. Jesus had said that a long time ago. Okay. So, one of the reasons why Bethel isn't growing, hasn't grown, has jumped up and down, people coming in, people going out, is because Bethel is primarily run for the Christians. By the way, that's why you have all this fighting and arguing and debates. Because we all have different tastes, we all have different prejudice, we all have different desires. And so we fight over, do I get what I want, as opposed to you get what you want. Okay. Second possible answer to the question why is we're not going to run the church for us. We're going to run the church for the people who don't know Jesus yet. Now, some churches do that, or at least try to, and some do it poorly, but a few do it well. Those who do it well, they just, boom, they're off the charts. Okay. Now, I'm going to use a national example just so you know, you've all heard of. I live in Sacramento, California. Our churches were in Northern California. And when our churches were turning around, we had about 700 people at different times go to a conference down at Saddleback. So you've all heard of Rick Warren, you all heard of Saddleback. Saddleback today, I don't know, somewhere probably between 25 and 30,000, and is still growing. And when you hear Rick Warren tell his story, Rick says when we had our initial church planning team together, when it was just, 30, 40, 50 of us, he said, I told the team, when you go out and invite people to church, don't invite anybody that goes to another church. Because we're not interested in people who go to other churches. We're interested in people who don't go to church, because if they don't go to church, they probably don't know Jesus. And Saddleback grew. Now, when I walked into, and I was with American Baptist churches, so I walked into the First Baptist Church of Napa, and of course Presbyterians all know where Napa is because you drink. So, I understand that. Baptists don't admit to knowing where Napa is at that point. But First Baptist Church of Napa, First Baptist Church of Santa Rosa, First Baptist Church of Fresno, all of them were called First Baptist. Okay. They're all dying. Whatever. It didn't take much to convince a church where there's only 20, 30 people. It's not working. Somebody's going to have to turn out the lights. And it didn't take a lot to say that purpose of running the church for you, it's not working. But I knew if I said to them, you've got to run the church for the people who don't know Jesus, like Saddleback does, they probably wouldn't buy it. So we suggested there's a third answer. Okay. First answer is we run it for us. Second answer, we run it for the people who don't know Jesus yet. Third answer was, we'll do both. And that's where most of our churches landed. But then they said, if we want to do both, okay, then I said to them, who gets priority? Because if we get priority, that takes us back to the first one. If we give priority, by that I mean being intentional about helping people. Now you realize in your vision frame, the last number that's in the vision frame is that you want to see 200 people in the next 9.5 years become brand new disciples of Jesus Christ. That's a goal you've set. And I asked a whole bunch of people, and all these 90-some people I talked to, I said, particularly with adults, how many people do you know who were not disciples of Jesus, but have become disciples of Jesus in the last 5 years at this church? And the highest number I got was 2. Now, I'm assuming, since I heard that from a number of people, there may have been 10 or 15 people. But how do you get that 200? Because right now, the church is not run to do that. It is run to serve the people who are here. Okay? So, to give you some biblical basis for this, look with me at number 2. Matthew 16:18 argues that the primary constituency the Church of Jesus Christ serves is those who are not yet disciples. I will build my church. Okay? Why? So the gates of hell will not prevail. Jesus said, I'm building the church to basically depopulate Satan's zip code. And so he's told us what the purpose is for. This is why ECO says this is what the church needs to be about. And here's what I'm telling you, folks. When I have found churches, this little church, Middle Presbyterian, out in the middle of Western Pennsylvania, in the middle of nowhere, is growing because they said, we're going to put the Great Commission first. They're still preaching the word. They're still singing praise courses and hymns. They're still doing children's Sunday school. But their priority is to say, how many people are going to come to Jesus this year? That's why we exist. So number 3, the only command in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:19-20, is to make disciples. Literally, it says, in your going, make disciples. In your teaching, make disciples. In your baptizing, make disciples. Therefore, the failure to make new disciples on a regular, consistent basis is disobedience to the command of God. I would argue that Bethel, just like our churches in Northern California, just like the other eco churches I've worked with, their biggest problem, I'm suggesting your biggest problem, is you're living in disobedience to Jesus Christ. Jesus says, make disciples. You're not making disciples. By the way, let me say, in one way, it's the easiest problem to solve. Because what happens when you come to God and say, forgive me? He forgives. Now, it means you also have to change your behaviors, but that's the problem. As I look at churches, as I look at our nation is filled with churches who say we believe the Bible, but we disobey Jesus Christ as a church. So number 4, the Church of Jesus Christ in North America, for the most part, has made the priority of its mission those who are already disciples. Note, according to ECO, mature disciples are those who go in the world and make more disciples. That's the third purpose that's in that statement. So, I'm just trying to lay it out for you out front. From my perspective, I think there is great hope for Bethel. But I don't think there's great hope if Bethel isn't willing to get serious with what the Bible says the church should be. Now, I've talked for a while. Anybody have any questions, cries of shock, outrage, pushback you want to ask? Right? Yeah.
So, just listening to you, Doctor, it seems like our visioning process helped the church discern where Jesus wants us to go.
I think it does. I think it was great. That was great.
From you is the process worked pretty good for us to kind of focus ourselves on what the priority is.
Right. And one of the questions I got from a lot of the people I was asking questions of, because I'd say, what do you think of Bethel 200? And the answer was, from many, we don't know. And that's legitimate, because by the time you're ready to start rolling out what you all have committed to as a session, COVID hits. So it's been kind of hard to roll it out at that point. But part of that is they've looked at some of the numbers and say, what are we doing differently now, et cetera. I think what the mission statement really helps you do is to say, and this is why I'm laying it out for the session, because you all make the decisions. Are we willing to say that not only is this our mission, but that's got to be a major change in our hearts? Okay? I mean, the reason why it's not the only reason, but the reason there's so much people upset about this, and everybody I talk to realizes that I've used the term that Bethel's filled with tribes. You got different tribes, and different tribes want different things, etc. Part of that is because everybody is assuming that the church is to serve them, rather than saying, no, the church is to help us serve them. And I think that frame has now started to cause you to think outside. But if there isn't a change in the heart, and it has to start with the leaders, that's not going to happen. Okay. So yeah, but I would agree. That's why normally when I work with a church, I got to get them to where you got to when you got the vision frame. Okay. So when I was working with that little middle Presbyterian church, they weren't even where you were at that point. Okay. All right. Other questions, comments? All right, I'll go on. Okay. So that's the first assumption I'm making. All right. Second assumption. That which is healthy grows, and that which is unhealthy does not grow. Those congregations that are not growing are not healthy. Okay. I mentioned the fact that my grandchildren are exceptional. Okay. All right. Our daughter, who lives in Denver, we live in Sacramento, at one time had 3 little girls under the age of 7, I think they were. And so when we would call, and she would just say, I just got back from the pediatrician with a baby for a checkup. As a proud grandfather, I'd ask 2 questions. How much does the baby weigh? And how many inches has the baby grown? Well, the reason why physicians weigh babies and measure babies is they realize that growth is the best sign of health. If you have an infant that is not putting on weight and you have an infant that is not growing in length, you have a very sick baby. And so when I went into our churches, which used to be 300, 500, 700, or down to 50, 60, 100 people, I said to them, you realize that there's more disease in the church than there is health. Now, that doesn't mean everything you do is bad. We're not saying that. But we're saying there's a lot of things going on that have to be changed in order to be healthy, okay? So number 2, the reason this congregation is not growing is that there's more disease than health. The good news is that congregations can have more health than disease, okay? Now, here's the problem, number 4. The biggest problem with becoming healthy is that health is a choice, and the older you get, the more difficult the choices, okay? So I now do marriage counseling in 15 seconds. Just do what she says. You want a happy marriage, just do what she says, okay? Once, in fact, 2 or 3 times in the week, I just go in the kitchen and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what I've done, but tell me what it is, and I promise you I won't do it again, okay? But what do you want me to do, okay? So, when I was age 50, my wife said to me, you will go to a doctor for your annual checkup. So, okay, all right, well, you say it, I'll go. So I've been going every year since I was 50 for my annual checkup. When I was 53, the doctor said to me, she said, Paul, you're at that age where we have to check your colon. I said, well, it's just about right here. You got a Sharpie, just put a check mark on it, And she said, we don't do it that way. And when she explained it, I really wasn't highly enthused, okay? Now, I didn't have to get my colon checked. That's a choice. Well, if my wife found out, then it's not a choice. But, I don't have to get my colon checked. But I did it. It wasn't pleasant. 3 years later, they said, we got to do it again. I said, okay, that's a choice. I did it. The doctor said, Paul, we have found polyps. We now have to do it again, and we have to do your entire colon. I said, can't we just settle for a semicolon? He said, no, it doesn't work that way, okay? I didn't have to do that. But 6 months later, did it again. He said, the polyps are gone. You don't have to do it for 5 years. Now, the reason why churches end up having more disease than health is that churches, for the most part, do not and cannot and often will not make the tough decisions. So, one of the stories I've heard over and over and over again is that Bill Kane needed to fire someone and wouldn't do it. And when pressured, he said, I'm not going to do it. You have to do it yourself, or you do it after I leave. Now, assuming, I don't know, but assuming that person should have been fired, that's a tough decision. Nobody likes to tell anybody, your job's over. But he said, I'm not going to do it. Okay? And apparently, Session never said to him, yes, you are. We're in charge. That's a tough decision to say that to the pastor. Okay? And so we end up becoming more diseased because we are unwilling to make the tough decisions. So what I'm going to be sharing with you, I'll tell you right now, in the report, I have great hope for Bethel. But I want to tell you, folks, it's not going to be easy. But it's things that we have found that if churches will do it, God honors it, and God shows up. And all of a sudden, the church begins to grow, and the church begins to change, because only God grows the church. Our job is to say, how do we create the environment? That's really what a farmer does. God grows corn, God grows tomatoes, God grows wheat. But what the farmer does is he creates an environment so that if God wants to grow things, it will grow. And that's what we have found, that if churches will create an environment that allows God to work, that's when God shows up. So, any questions you want to make on the second assumption?
Well, here's a question.
Okay.
So you said that over the time, we've seen our numbers go up and down, up and down.
Right.
What does that mean? And we've seen that over decades, two decades. What does that mean about the health of our church? If when it's growing, it's healthy? It doesn't sound that way, because then it's declining. No. So what are we?
Okay. I'll answer that this way. There's two ways to grow a church in the United States today. I believe, although one works, it's not biblical. God's way works because God wants to make it work. So, and I'll get the answer to the question. So, many, not all, but many of the mega churches have grown because they have outserviced all the other churches around them. They have better preaching, they have better music, they have better worship, they have better youth, they have better children, they have better media, they have better this, they have better that. And because Christians, all Christians, including all Christians, we all come to church as a consumer. Okay? Now, I didn't, when I was at the Bible college, and I didn't understand this, I'd be out every Sunday preaching in different churches, so I get paid so I could go home and buy some food. And when my son got to be 12, he said, "Dad, my sister and I are tired of being drug around from church to church every Sunday, always meeting new kids. Can we find a church in Denver? So if you have to drive to Kansas to preach, we can at least have friends." I said, "Sure." So he's 12. So one of my major criteria in finding a church was a church that had a good youth group. Because I knew he was at the age where he was going into a youth group. I'm a consumer. Okay. Now, also, I wanted a church that had multiple services. So when the Broncos played on the East Coast, I could get home for the 10 o'clock game. Of course, that's a consumer. Okay. When I get to church, if I'm just me, now I'm not preaching anything, I sit on the back row. Best seat in the house. And I want to sit on the edge because I've got long legs and I want to put my feet out in the aisle if I have to. And I hate it when new people come in and they want me to move over so new people can get in. And my feeling is, I was here on time, climb over. I'm sorry, I didn't know, exposing my carnality to you, okay? But the point is a consumer. So there have been times when things that Bethel has done has been what certain consumers want. So, let me take Bill Kane, because I've talked to more people who know Bill because he's more recent than Dee Dee. Many people liked his preaching. Many people liked the fact that he would call them or visit them and, do all the pastoral stuff. There were things about Bill they liked. Now, if at the same time their children happened to be age where there was, they really liked Jan. If she was here, I think there was some overlap. So hey, my kids are happy. I'm happy. In fact, most people who visit the church, if they got young children, if they come back next week, it's because of what the kids say in the back seat on the way home. And I've had parents say to me when I've been consulting with the church, I say, "How long have you been here?" "Oh, we've been here about 10 years. I said, "Well, good. Are you going to be here another 5? "Oh, no. We're going to be gone next year." I said, "Why?" "Well, the preaching really isn't good, but the youth program is great." but our son graduates next year. So we're out of here. And by the way, what's the term we use when we look for a church? You shop for a church. So when Bethel has had things or people here or staff or programs that have really helped things go, then often there has been growth. And when that person leaves or people get upset or that which they want is taken away, they leave. Okay. But in the meantime, the structure is in part there. The other piece of it is the way your church is structured. Structure in a church is like a skeleton. If you can see your skeleton, you're in deep trouble. Okay? Without a skeleton, you're a blob on the floor. Okay? If your skeleton doesn't grow and develop, you will eventually die. I was working with a church down in Houston, and the pastor introduced, I was going to do an interview with two men, and the pastor said, by the way, both these guys work for NASA, they're rocket scientists, but don't let that bother you. When they both stood up, one guy was as tall standing up as he was sitting down. He said, by the way, he said, I didn't tell you, I have a disease. The doctor said that when I was about 10 or 11, my skeleton would stop growing. Most people have my disease, die as a teenager. He said, I'm retiring from NASA this year. I'm a living miracle of God. Okay. And so you have a structure that does not support more than 400 or 500 people. And that's because that takes very special. I mean, I'm convinced that Dede was a highly gifted leader. He probably didn't know it, but he was. And he had what, if you take strength finders, he probably had what's called woo. People wanted to be around him. And so you could get past the structure, but when he left, the structure wouldn't support it. So that's another piece. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this. Okay. Does that answer the question? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Third assumption. The gospel message never changes, but the Church of Jesus Christ must be changing constantly. Now, I've heard here you all are just changing so fast. I would say it's nice that you finally got from 1950 to 1970. Okay, I mean, it's happened fast, but be careful, you might go too far. I'm being facetious. The story of the book of Acts is one of continual change. If you'll notice the book of Acts, every time the church got comfortable, God sent something. I mean, it's very interesting. In Acts 8, God had told the people, including the apostles, leave Jerusalem. Go to Judea, Samaria, the uttermost part of the earth. And they're all still in Jerusalem. And so God sends persecution. Now, you're a Presbyterian. Do you realize what God's saying? If you don't do what I want, I'm going to kill a few of you. I mean, you think music's a big thing. What about persecution? Okay. So the church in the book of Acts. Now, I wanted to give you an overview of the church because this has a lot of relationship to what's going on now. Era 1, the day of Pentecost until 400 AD, and 400 AD may be a little bit too far, but I want to round it off. The Church of Jesus Christ grew from a handful of Christians to 30 million people. I don't know if you realize that. When Constantine in, was it 312 or 313, when he made Christianity the world religion, that's because 50% of the world would be what we call evangelical Christians. By the way, here's how the church grew. In 152 and in, I think it was 241, 240, somewhere in there, the Roman Empire went through two major plagues. Sociologists think one was the Black Plague, the other may have been smallpox, but the whole empire pretty much went through plagues. And the Romans knew enough that when a plague hit, they had to get out of the towns and the cities. Okay, and so literally what they would do is they would take all the bodies of people who died or people who were sick and had the plague, and they would literally put them in piles in the field, just like cord wood. And then they'd leave for 5, 10, 15 years, however long the plague was. The only people who stayed in the cities or the towns were the Christians. And they went out and went through these piles. If you can imagine how gruesome that is, went through these piles, and anyone that was living, they picked them up and took them home. And many of them died as they were nursing these sick people. And when the Romans came back and realized that some of their relatives they had put in the pile, assuming they would die, were living, and it was the Christians that had done that to them, the church just expanded. By the way, in our day and age, let's take the last plague before COVID, which was AIDS. Christians ran from the plague rather than helping people with the plague. Okay. But they did that twice. The second thing that the Christians did was most Romans wanted one boy child. It was almost like China, one male child. If they had 2 boys, 3 boys, or had girls, they would often just put them out in the field and let them die as a baby. And the Christians would go out and find these babies and bring them home and basically adopt them. And after a while, the only people who had girls were Christians. And when guys wanted to get married, they said, well, let's talk to you first of all about Jesus Christ. You want to get married? You got to become a Christian. And the church mushroomed. Okay. So that's the first 300 years of the church. Era 2, 400 AD to 1945. And the reason I picked 1945, it's the end of World War II. The Church of Jesus Christ grew in influence in the Western world and what was called Christendom. Now, in Christendom, the teachings and values of the church were part of the culture. So I started school in 1949, and all the way through elementary school, every day when I walked into school, once we could read, 2nd grade on, the teacher would hand somebody a Bible, say, read a psalm, lead us in the Lord's Prayer, and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, as I look back, most of the kids I went to school with didn't go to church, even though it was a little town. But they had to read a psalm whether they wanted to or not. They had to know the Lord's Prayer whether they wanted to or not. The only advantage us Christian kids had is I always read Psalm 119 because that was really long. It meant less math that day. Nothing like using the Bible for your own ends. But anyway, I was a kid. All right. That was Christendom. In Christendom, you thought nothing of taking tax dollars and putting up the town nativity scene. In Christendom, you had the 10 Commandments in courtrooms because the teaching and the values of the church were part of the culture. Now, here's the problem. Most of our churches were built, and many of them function today as though Christendom existed. And we just make an assumption about all people being Christian. Do you realize that by 2025, 55% of the population in the United States, when given surveys about religious beliefs and affiliations, check none? None. They're called the nuns. 55% of the population in just 5 more years. Christendom has gone away. And I find, particularly, I'm 76, people, Christians my age, what they miss more than often the church is this whole idea of Christendom. Okay, we all realize that goods and services are advertised on television today that my parents would not talk about in the bedroom. Okay. But the church was made for a Christendom culture. We just assume people are going to come through doors. That's one of the reasons why churches are declining, is because when I grew up in my little town of 1,200 in farming community in South Jersey, we had 3 churches. There was the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, and the Baptist Church. On a given Sunday, there were probably 600 people in one of those 3 churches, which meant there were 600 people who weren't in church. But if you went to each one of them and said, why aren't you in church? They had an excuse ready because they knew they were supposed to be in church. Today, people drive by your church on Sunday and think, look at those stupid people going to church. Okay, so the culture is changing, which brings us to era 3, 1945 to 2000. The church in Europe and North America is declined, or has declined, while it grew the fastest in Eastern and Southern hemispheres. So I said on Sunday, 30,000 people a day in China become brand new believers. 30,000 people a day in Latin America become brand new believers. And the church today, the leading churches today are not in North America. They're in Latin America, they're in China, they're in Korea, they're in all those places, okay? Now, 2000 to the present. Christendom has died in the Western world while Christianity is growing in the rest of the world. The Western world is now a secular one. That's a world we don't understand if we have been in church all of our life. We don't understand a secular world. And the primary means for reaching that whole world is now digital, virtual, as opposed to the written word through mechanized printing. It's interesting that if you're doing virtual church, in all probability, the people who are doing it are at least under 40, maybe under 35. I'm at now at Malibu Pacific Church, which used to be Malibu Press. We're training a whole corps of teenagers to do our virtual service. They're excited because this is their world. And they're teaching our 35-year-old stuff they don't know. And so what I'm saying is I've heard we're changing too fast. Folks, you can't change fast enough if you really want to do the mission of Jesus. If the primary target is not us, but the primary target that is out there, change has to happen. In fact, here's a new phenomenon that has never happened in history. Let's see. Here's time, and this is innovation. I'm going to get another marker here. This is the invention of things. And if this is the rate of new things being invented, the ability of the human race to keep up with it has gone like this. But as of 2007, the pace of change has gone like this. And for the first time in history, it is impossible for the human race to keep up with change. So in this book, thanks for being late. The writer from the New York Times wrote The Earth is Flat, and Tom Friedman talks about the fact that we don't know how to live with this culture. Now, I can understand, as someone who's 76, who has to say to my grandchild, will you help me with the phone? Okay. What it's like to live with a world that's just changing. I mean, in some ways, I'm glad I'm 76, because I know how to do ministry to some degree now. 10 years from now, I'm not going to know anything in order to reach a secular culture. And if you want to see Bethel reach these next generations, change has to happen. So the assumption is the gospel never changes, but the church must be changing constantly. Questions? Anything?
People say around the church building, we're changing too fast. Mm-hmm. We're not. We've got to slow down. We don't have anything in its place. How do we respond as elders to the fact that no, we've got to keep pushing?
Okay. Well, first of all, part of the issue is, all of us, by time and place, get comfort from that which is familiar. Okay. Yet, at the same time, well, first of all, sometimes I also hear the statement, we don't like change. That's not true. All of us like change if it benefits us. I mean, any of you ladies here who decide you want to have a second baby after the first one? Sleepless nights, all that stuff you women have to go through. But if you want a second child, you'll make the changes, okay? I couldn't wait to get from high school to college. That's a major change, okay? So we have to realize that when we say we're struggling with change, it's because it's making us uncomfortable. And I understand that. But the point is, if I really understand the New Testament, Jesus hasn't called me to be comfortable. I mean, you think about the test of discipleship is what? If you're willing to die. And I have to understand that, I will tell you, I do not like contemporary music, Christian music. I was raised where I like an organ, I like a choir, I like a good Presbyterian service. I like the doxology. I like all of that. But here's what I tell churches. If I like your worship, and that's the only kind of worship you have, you're in deep trouble. Because it's not about me. And by the way, I can have my music 24/7. I got a CD. It takes me about a half hour when I'm living in Sacramento to drive to the airport, and the planes all leave about 5:30 in the morning. So I'm driving through the dark to get to the airport, and it's all hymns. Man, it is cool. I can have that. But I realize that if we keep ministering just to me, not only am I disobeying God, the church is going to die anyway. Okay. And the problem with churches like Bethel is right now you have enough people not to feel the urgency. Okay. Like I said the other, I talked about being the best restaurant in the hospital. It's like being valedictorian of summer school. That kind of a thing, And so, yeah, we understand it, but say, no, wait a minute. We aren't called to what's comfortable for us. I have to be called to what's up. And I encouraged our churches to move to contemporary music. And our churches had organs and they had choirs. And in fact, American Baptists in California, a lot of the pastors up until the 90s still wore robes. But they realized if we do that, we're never going to reach the people God's calling us to reach. Now, there are times, and I'm going to talk about this. I think you should have a traditional service, because I realize there are some millennials, there are some Generation Z, there are unbelieving 60-year-olds who come out of Roman Catholic traditions, Lutheran traditions, Presbyterian. I would want to have the most exciting traditional service there is, not for us, but to reach people. Okay. I want to have the best contemporary service. That's why Tim Keller in New York City, they have a jazz service, because they have some of the best jazz musicians in the country, but they have a jazz service. 25 years ago, I was working with a Lutheran church in Ramsey, Minnesota. Now, Ramsey, Minnesota is a suburb of Minneapolis. They had 1,000 people coming, and they had 5 services. And every Sunday, they had a liturgical service, a traditional service, a blended service, a contemporary service, and a country western service. And every Sunday, the pastor went from robes to boots. Okay. Now, how you worship God with boots on, I have no idea. They did sing all the praise courses backwards, so they have a happy ending. Okay, at that point, But what they were saying is, even in Minneapolis, people will come across the stained glass barrier if there is something that helps them at least identify with their cultural background. And by the way, all the hymns we love were not sung when they were first written. You look at church history, they were all too contemporary. They were too wild. They would, today, most classical music, and you look at, when you saw the movie about Mozart, they thought he was crazy. And today, that's classical music. Why? Because it's lost its cultural identity at that point. But that's been true with every generation. It just is happening faster today. And I understand that, I really do. And there's a sense I feel empathy for that, and then sometimes we have to help people say, all right, how can we help you? Now, I think that's why it's great that pre-COVID you had 2 services. Okay? In fact, I would hope one day you get to 3 or 4 or 5 services and just don't make any of them same. When we had 11 services, we gave people choice of music, choice of preacher, choice of food, we had 2 services that had coffee breaks in the middle. We had a 5 o'clock service on Sunday night for street people. The first time I went to that service, I was dressed like this to preach. I was the street people. I thought I had a tuxedo on. I was overdressed. But they would come because we were trying to reach them where they were. Again, you start where people are to bring them to where they should be. Questions? Yeah.
Any commentary about the point you make here about digital versus the Gutenberg?
Oh, yeah. You look at, Gutenberg was revolutionary. Okay. Up until then, almost all communication was oral. Even in the New Testament, when Paul's letter was sent to the church, they read it out loud so people would have it. So when Gutenberg comes along, it changes everything. Now, when I was growing up, my father, who was born in 1901, always said to me, son, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper. Why? Because that had become authoritative. Okay? By the way, books today are not authoritative to the younger generation. Studies show that when college students are asked to do a term paper on the assassination, they quote, who's the movie director that, Oliver Stone. Okay, as though it's authority. The screen today has become the authority. So when churches say, we don't like screen, you have to realize if you want to reach younger people, a book is no longer authoritative. The screen was. But before 1400, books were not authoritative. What was authoritative was the cathedral, because all the architecture was designed to teach the Bible. I'm a big fan of the navigators that are really into having quiet time. And I always say, what did David read during quiet time? David had memorized those things. Well, some of them he wrote, but they were in his head. Now, some of them eventually got written down, but people didn't have Bibles. And so we have to understand that's why the gospel is unchangeable, but the gospel has to be ministered in different cultures. So yeah, what happened with Gutenberg, and 2007, by the way, all the changes that are pointed out in the book that came about in 2007 are primarily related to this. Okay? Because this is the authority for most young people. Okay? Doesn't mean it is, doesn't mean it isn't, but for them, it's the authority. Okay? All right, I want to move to elders and rule. Are we okay? We're doing okay, or do we need a break?
You all want a couple minutes just to stand? You're okay. Well, if you want to stand, just stand.
Okay.
Don't be rude.
All right. Criteria for elders. One of the questions I've been asking as I was talking to people is, what's the criteria for elders to be on session at Bethel? Now, 1 Timothy 3, 1-7, and Titus 1, 5-9, Paul gives his criteria for elders. Now, most of the requirements relate to the character of the person, okay? However, both Timothy and Titus speak of a key responsibility. Timothy says, able to teach, and Titus says, encourage others by sound doctrine. And so the question that I would say is, as you look at an elder, not only should you have the right kind of character, and that character should be developing, but how are you preparing to be able to say, when we make decisions in session, when we decide what should happen, how does that go back to the Bible? Do we talk about it from a biblical point of view? Do we talk about our mission from Matthew 16? I will build my church so the gates of hell will not prevail. That's part, it seems to me, of the role of an elder. Now, the role of elder, 1 Peter 5, 1-4. Elders work for the chief shepherd, who is Jesus Christ. Okay? It's amazing to me in Presbyterian Church how many elders think they work for the congregation. Folks, this is not Congress, which is doing so well. This is not Parliament. If you're an elder, you are a shepherd under the chief shepherd. Now, I need to talk about shepherding because I've heard a lot about shepherding as I've interviewed people, and most of it is skewed. Elders serve the sheep, but do not work for the sheep. Big difference, okay? You watch over the sheep, that's out of 1 Peter 5. Now, in Jesus' day, shepherds led sheep into green pastures, so they fed them. They also led them by still waters because you did not want sheep to drown, and if it was running water, they would drown. But you did that to do three things with the sheep. Get their wool, and I've been to Australia enough to know that sheep do not like to give up their wool. Okay? To kill them for food, which is kind of total commitment. Okay? And reproduce. Okay? Most Christians' image of shepherding comes from 18th century romanticism. It does not come from what shepherds do and shepherds did. Now, the reason why you want to have good Bible teaching is to feed the sheep, to make sure the sheep are watered. But the purpose of taking sheep into zones of comfort is to demand of the sheep that they enter into zones that are quite uncomfortable. So one of the things you have to wrestle with when someone comes to you as an elder to complain, is this really legitimate? You know, has somebody mistreated them or whatever? Or are they just complaining because this is what we think the sheep should be doing to follow Jesus Christ? And I find many times elders don't distinguish. In fact, many elders think if people come to me with a complaint because they don't like something, then somehow I have to deal with it. Now, one of the things we taught our elders, and by the way, even though we were Baptists, we called them elders and said, you will act like elders. And about most of our churches, the only thing they would end up voting on would be the budget. Okay, but the elders, for the most part, like Presbyterian around the church, I said, when somebody comes to you and says, do you know what so-and-so did? Often it might be a staff member, it might be some other leader. We said, wait a minute. I take it you're upset about something that somebody did. Yes, I am. Well, I need to ask you, have you talked to that person? No, I haven't talked to that person. Well, then you need to understand, I can't listen to you because if I listen to you, I am entertaining gossip. You need to go talk to that person first. So you have a problem with something happened in the youth program, or you had a problem happening something with the children, or something they didn't like in worship. Have you talked to them? Person in charge. And sometimes people say, well, the last time I talked to him, it didn't go well. So we said, all right, here's what you do. You say, I'll set up a meeting so that you can talk to this person and they can talk to you, and I'll referee the conversation to make sure that you don't run over them and they don't run over you, that you listen to them, that they listen to you, and that hopefully we have a fruitful dialogue. And if the person says, no, I'm not doing that, then you say, well, fine, I can't listen to it. But if I hear of you talking to anyone else in the church about this, you'll come before session for discipline. Because that's gossip. I learned this early in my ministry. Made a lot of mistakes in my first, but one thing I learned well, I remember how a lady came out of church and she said to me one day, she said, Pastor, I can't tell you anything about anybody. I said, why? She says, because you go tell them I said it. Well, I said, well, yeah, I was just being truthful. You said it. Why are you dumping it on me? Okay. We need to understand that elders need to act like shepherds and that often the complaints elders get are because sheep don't want to give up the wool, they don't want to get killed, or they don't want to reproduce. Okay, so I saw some things in writing, people say, well, we have 2 services, why don't we just have 1 service? Well, one of the reasons why you want 2 services is that it helps you have more people, gives more options. It's not just about us, but it's why we're doing this. And people need to understand, this is one of the ways you give up some wool. This is some of the ways you give up whatever it is. So you watch over the sheep. You do not lord over them, means place unreasonable demands, but you are also examples. You model Jesus Christ. And by the way, one of the reasons why I asked for the list of what all the session members gave in 2019 is, I believe, and this is what we began to practice in our churches, that if the session or the elders are going to be responsible ultimately for the budget, then you as an elder, I as an elder, need to model biblical generosity. And we actually said to the elders, you've got to show us what you gave last year. Get your income tax return. And some of them start out by saying, well, this is just between me and God. I said, well, if you get an income tax deduction, it's not between you and God. It's also between you and God and the IRS. And by the way, if you get a mortgage, it's between you and God and the IRS and your banker. So if you just give cash and you don't want income tax deduction, then maybe I'll buy it's between you and God. Okay. But one of the foolish things churches do is they make people leaders who are not willing to model what Jesus Christ taught. What's been interesting as we worked with eco churches, elders have stepped up and said, we will be accountable for inviting so many people to church. Now, this is pre-COVID. We will be responsible for inviting so many people to church for the next 3 months. The number one reason why people come to church is because they're asked. So the pastor says, I'm going to set a goal. The elders have said, we will set a goal, but they've also said, we will also be responsible for sharing the good news of the gospel so many times in the next 3 months. Because if you're going to expect the congregation to invite people, if you're going to expect the congregation to give, if you're going to expect the congregation to reach 200 new disciples for Jesus Christ in the next 9.5 years, if the session doesn't model it, it's not going to happen. Okay? Now, I'm going to stop there before we get to the last page. Any questions anybody wants to ask about elders?
One comment, one question. Comment would be, we receive these reports, but the way the data is formatted, you can't read it if you looked at it.
You mean the report you got?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I don't know about that. The report I got was laid out, so.
Referring to Tom.
Okay.
There's a report, everything's crunched together. You can't even read the data on my report.
You have to download it, and if, like, if
think
you open
somebody
it
else
up
did.
in your Word, it's fine.
Well, if not, I would say, can they send it
We
and
can
send
send
again
it
or
to you
do
by
something?
You have to download it. It's like what Dia said, whenever you get into this, you have to actually open it with your Word document. You have to open it.
Because it'll open, in Teams, it opens by default online, and that doesn't always look very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't even read it.
Right.
So at the top, you can just say open in app.
Well, I heard several other people ran into the same
Yeah.
situation. Okay.
Everybody would have that.
But Buster, if you want, I'm happy to send it to you by email. I wish I had known ahead of tonight that was an issue.
Paul asked a question when we talked, and I said, I can't read it. I don't know what to,
Yeah.
that type of thing. The question I have, and it's probably too specific, but what does rotation do as far as the session? It seems to me like that took place back in 30 years ago. And what do you see that? I mean, I feel like some sessions are on board, and then come January, you might have a change of a vote, a change of heart, there's no continuity, there's no follow-up, you maybe have a new pastor, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, okay. One of the things I'm going to talk about tomorrow in the report, because it relates to where you want to go in regard to the mission frame, is a change in the structure of how the church is structured. And part of that needs to occur, and this is what we were able to do in our churches, is that criteria, very specific criteria, needs to be established before an elder can even get nominated. Okay, or I would say an elder, where there would be criteria for elder, criteria for deacon, but before they get nominated, they have to submit, and often with a personal interview. So, for example, now that you've achieved the mission frame, I don't think anyone should sit on session who can't support that mission frame. Because if that's what the session had agreed to, this is now going to be the mission and vision. We got to roll it out. We got to figure out some things. We got to implement it. But if that's going to be the criteria for it to have teeth, then rotation really plays a role in that, because it's very easy within 2 or 3 years, you could have the session who don't agree to that. Okay. If you're going to set criteria in terms of giving, which I think should. If you're going to set criteria in terms of other behaviors and other character issues that I think should be part of the criteria, that's the way I think you address it, which means then often you've got to change the bylaws in the sense that when the nominating, if you're going to use a nominating committee, if there's going to be a nominating committee, the nominating committee has to make sure that these criteria have been thoroughly checked with the people who are willing to be nominated, so that when you have people coming on the session, there is at least some common agreement of what's required. That's the way we address that in our churches, in terms of, because you're right. If there are no specific criteria for elders on session, the session changes within 2 or 3 years because of who is on it. And that's the only way. If you really want to get serious about saying we're going to do this, then I think that's where the church has to step up to it. And I would say, at this point, if an elder gets to the point, as we roll some of these things out, and if session says we're going to do this, some of the things I'm going to suggest tomorrow, the session says we're going to do it. You have time, you pray about it, you talk about it, but hopefully you make a decision in a month or two, because right now it's time to move. If people who are on session can't agree to that, I would hope they would have the integrity to step off session. You can't make them, but hopefully, I've said that to eco churches. If you can't commit to where the church says they want to go, then why do you want to be in a leadership position? Some people, I want to be the devil's advocate. I say, well, I know he pays better, but you understand that we're serious about the Great Commission. If this is where we're going to go, then you've got to have session members who commit to that. So that's the way we've handled it. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Partly, we'll talk about the rest of it tomorrow.
Okay, all right, yeah. Okay, yeah. Good question, excellent question though, but because that's an issue. Okay? Other questions?
Just an observation and then a question. As all of this technology changes and we have all the demands from culture about change, it would seem that certainly our greatest responsibility is that the gospel message has never changed.
That's right.
How do we mesh those things in that change? Okay.
I think that's where you need to take those who are theologically alert, whether, in some cases it may be a pastor, in other cases it may be other people who are in the church, in other cases it may be somebody on Presbytery, in other cases it may be somebody at National, or to look at other churches you respect to say, all right, what does it mean to reflect the God? If this compromises the gospel, then we shouldn't do it. Let me give you 2 examples. Some years ago, I was at the Crystal Cathedral for a pastor's conference, and Stephen Short, not Stephen, but Short, the Vineyard Church in Cincinnati. I don't know if the church grew went around doing helps. They actually planted the church by doing free car washes in downtown Cincinnati. And the people stop and they wash the car and say, no, but we have a church. Why don't you come? And the church got to about maybe 1,000, 2,000 people. In the late 90s, they decided that the most persecuted people in America were smokers. That was when you used to get on an airplane and they would say, this flight is non-smoking, and everybody would applaud. You ever wondered how the smokers felt? Or this flight is not smoking at all, and they're sitting there saying, I got 4 hours and nobody told me this, et cetera. And so it was, or you drive by, even today, you drive by business communities in the middle of the winter, and, I don't know about you, but I feel so superior when I drive by, you poor, whatever, So now this was before the internet and stuff. They went out, and by the way, the convenience stores that sold cigarettes stopped giving out matchbooks because the price of cigarettes was going up and their margin of profit was down. So they went out and printed thousands of matchbooks. And on the front it said, "We love smokers." And on the back was the name, address, and phone number of the church. And they went to all the 7-Elevens, the Circle C's, all the places, just said, here, give these out. And of course, they loved it because it was now value added when they gave the cigarettes. He said within 6 months, we had 400 people coming to our church because we love smokers, and they were smokers. And I said, we're a smoke-free environment. So we had to designate one doorway where they had to stand every Sunday if they wanted to smoke. He said, every Sunday there's a big blue cloud out there. Okay. Now he said, there would be some churches that say, we don't want that blue cloud. Okay. But they began to reach smokers. So, but that's the kind, you guys say, all right, are we compromising the gospel? Well, Jesus said, man, I love the sinners. Okay. The woman in adultery, he was kind to her. The prostitutes are there. I mean, even the Republicans showed up. At that point, and we're there. So that's the kind of issue. Then you got to sit there and say, does it? If you think it does, then you don't do it. If it works and you believe it's okay biblically, then you do it. We planted 100 churches in California in my last 10 years there. Santa Monica I'm now doing a Malibu. Santa Monica is the next town down, and it's almost as pagan as Malibu. Just very anti anything Christian. And so the husband and wife and the church planting team, for 6 months before the church plant opened, every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, they walked into all the bars and taverns. They'd catch them all because Santa Monica was a pretty big place. And they gave out free shot glasses. And on the shot glasses said, give us a shot. And then there was the church's website. And they said, you wouldn't believe the conversations we have about Jesus and God and the Bible website. The first Sunday they launched in a movie theater, they had 265 people the first Sunday. 65 people were the launch team. And 200 people were people who had gotten free shot glasses. About the third week, all these were younger people. About a third week, this older lady comes in and she says, where's the pastor? He says, I'm the pastor. He says, I just want you to know, my 2 30-year-old sons still live at home. I can't get rid of them. I wanted to come to a church that thought of enough to walk into a bar and give them a free shot glass and invite them to church. Okay. Again, if you think you can do that, then you do it. If you're not, then you say, no, that's too much compromise. And everybody's going to draw the line differently. That's really where the session, that's why you need to know theology. That's why you need to know the doctrine. That's the kind of thing the session ought to be saying is, do we want that strategy? If we do, then we'll do it. If not, then we won't do it. And that's how I think you come at those issues. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So give you some ideas for reaching out too. Okay. Okay. All right. Turn with me to the back.
We did that at BYE.
Huh?
And we did that at BYE, which is a restaurant that has a bar in it. Mm. And I know I got flack personally. I don't know if any of you all got flack about it, but what are you doing having a Christian thing in the bar? Yeah. And did anybody else besides me? Okay, so yeah. It was like, so we tried it. Yeah. Now, I think that was a minor voice. I hope it was.
Well, I heard negative things since I Just so you know, well, okay. I know, that's all right, okay.
I like the shot glass over the matches.
Well, I'm dealing with Presbyterians, that's why, okay, okay, all right. All right, one of the questions that comes up in all of this is, well, if you're asking us to give up our wool, or you're asking us to give up our meat or reproduce, when are you, well, Jesus wouldn't do that. And I find that people always want to take Jesus' name when it fits them, rather than looking at both sides of who Jesus was. I mean, Jesus cared. I mean, it was interesting. He cared for women. He cared for the downtrodden. He cared for the sick. I mean, Jesus at his most, and I mean this in the best biblical sense, his most cantankerous was really when he was with religious people. I mean, that's when he laid into them, or his disciples. So I want to give you a few passages to show what Jesus did. So in Mark 1, this is when Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, okay? And so it says in Mark chapter 1, verse 32, that evening after sunset, because the Sabbath was over, that's why it was after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. Now, I've tried to imagine, here it is Sabbath, everybody's supposed to be at home. How did the town know that Peter's done this? I think the kids were out playing and being bad. Just say, we got Jesus. Now, see what he did to Grandma. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. So that's how the evening ends. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and left the house and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone's looking for you." Now, many of the commentators believe they're either looking to be healed or they want to hear some more teaching. Jesus, there are people here, they want you. Now, in our day and age, we say, oh, well, we got to go. Look what Jesus does. Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Jesus had a clear mission frame, if I can use that. And his evaluation of his ministry was not based on the demands of people. It was based on how well he carried out his mission. And so, yes, there were times he was very gracious, but there were other times where he said, no, I'm on this mission. I've got to do this. And we need to understand, if your church is going to be on the mission, there's going to be a lot of people who say, well, what about us? Every time I talk the way I'm talking to you tonight, every time I go to a church, somebody says, but what about us? And I want to say, look at your budget. Everything in the budget's about us, for the most part. What about us? But we also have a mission. Then, Matthew 16. I want to go there and, oops. Here's where Jesus talks about the church, etc. So, in verse 15. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I will tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed on heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was Messiah. Really interesting. Then, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord. This will never happen to you. By the way, what do you think we're following you? You're going to bring the kingdom. We can't wait. Who's going to? Peter and John, or James and John, one wants to sit right, one wants to sit on the left. This is going to be awesome. You're not going to die. And Jesus turned to him and said, Peter, get behind me, Satan. In fact, in Mark, it says, he looks at Peter, looking at the disciples, saying, I'm arguing for us, guys. And Jesus says, Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. We'd say, boy, that's not very pastoral. That's not very shepherd. But Jesus, when Peter was right, man, he honored him. But when he blew it because of what he wanted, he said, no, 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 no. This is satanic in its doctrine, in its theology. Okay? And then Matthew chapter 10. In verse 5. Okay? The 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. In other words, other times he sends them to the Gentiles, but he says, this is a Jewish mission. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out the demons. Freely you have received, freely you give. Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worthy his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for someone worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it, and if it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you, listen to your words and leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I tell you, it would be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment for that town. You need to realize, folks, if you say we're going to put the unbeliever first, you're going to have people in the church who say, but what about us? And if you're not going to meet what I want, I'm going to leave. I'm going to do this. Now, when we turn a church around, I say to the pastor, take as many people with you as you can. You want to take as many as you can. But if they don't want to go, you don't beg them. You don't say stay. Jesus said, if they receive you, bless them, serve them, help them. And if not, you leave. And all I'm saying is, we need to be sure we balance the compassion of Jesus, the love of Jesus, the kindness of Jesus, with the justice of Jesus, the truth of Jesus, the holiness of Jesus, so that as the church of Jesus Christ, we represent both sides. Any comments or questions you want to ask on these verses? Okay, we're going to end at 8:30. There's hope. I always want to offer hope, so we are going to end on 8:30. But I want to give out one other handout because there's at least one thing I want to do. So, Tom, if I could ask you to help with this. And got to put these Packer fans to work so they are worth something. Okay. Whenever I work with a congregation, I want to try and help that congregation understand where they are on their current life cycle. You and I only get one life cycle. Okay? In fact, as I look around the room, some of you are following me on that final glide path. Okay? I have far more years behind me than I do ahead of me. Okay? And the only way my life cycle can get changed is by resurrection. And God's not doing that now, not even for charismatics and Pentecostalists. He's going to one day, but he's not doing it now. The good news is that churches can have multiple life cycles. So one of our churches, the First Baptist Church of San Francisco, founded in 1849. So they are true 49ers. Okay. If you'd gone to a church service in 1943, you would have sat in a worship service with 1,000 people. If you'd gone to the church in the late 50s, you would have sat in a worship service with about 150 people. If you'd gone to a church service in the late 60s, early 70s, you would have sat in worship with about 600 people. It was the Jesus movement, and the ferment in the culture was going on in the church. When I did a church consultation with them in 1998, it was 170 old white people who used to live in San Francisco. They now live in the suburbs. So they'd come into the city, they'd unlock the building, worship God, lock the building, fill the moat with alligators so nobody would touch the building, and go back out to the suburbs. 5 years later, there's 500 people in church every Sunday. The average age is 32. Every third person is Asian. And 60% of the church population was single, which reflected the kind of people who actually lived in San Francisco. So when you look at the history of First Baptist Church of San Francisco, the church would grow up and then begin to decline, and then go up again, and then begin to decline, and then go up again. There's been about 12 churches there. They've all existed as the First Baptist Church of San Francisco, but they're 12 different churches. Okay. So when Dee Dee was here, the church grew up, goes down. Bill Kane comes, goes up again, begins to go down. And now the church is down in that valley compared to where it used to be. And so it's time for the church to start a new life cycle. So if you look at the life cycle on this first page, this one's divided into 10 categories, from birth up to adulthood, then from maturity down to death. You will notice on the other side of the line, there are 4 letters. There's a V, an R, an M, and an S. Sometimes those letters are capitalized, sometimes they are in lower case. If they're capitalized, it means it's strong in the life of the church. If they're in lower case, it means it is weak in the life of the church. Now, you'll notice as you go up the life cycle, the V is strong all the way up through adulthood. As you go down the life cycle, the only letter that is, for the most part, capitalized all the way down is structure. So, where's the, do I have the eraser in here? Yeah.
On the left-hand side of the wood.
Oh, sorry, okay. So, here's a life cycle. Here's an automobile. You're in a helicopter looking down on a convertible. This is my car. It's oblong, so it's a Volvo. Okay, here's the steering wheel. This represents a church going up the life cycle. Church is going up life cycle. The V is always behind the steering wheel driving it. That's vision. Now, as I said on Sunday, the reason I think vision is so important is that it's all about hope. What are we going to accomplish? That's what your vision frame is all about. What are we going to accomplish? The R is about people connecting to the vision. Okay, I've been with churches who believed if you build it, they will come. And they built it, and guess what? Nobody came. I don't have to go to church to see new buildings. But where the church is exciting, things are happening, people come. Which means that ministry, Sunday school ministry, children's ministry, youth ministry, small group ministry, all is always trying to catch up along with structure. Now, same church going down life cycle. Okay. You'll notice that when you get to the peak, the thing that causes down is that the vision goes to the back seat. And when vision is in the back seat, you start down the life cycle. And when vision goes, people go. Because vision provides hope and there's no hope. Ministries come up here in the passenger seat and churches create what I call an Avis church. Hertz is number 1, Avis is number 2, so they always try harder. If we just did youth better, Pastor, if you just preach better, if we could just sing better, if we could just have better musicians, the church will grow. And then, of course, I'm running backwards here, so this may look backwards. but structure takes over. Okay. And you got to say, does it have to go through this committee? Does it have to get to the session? Has it go back to deacons? Does it have to go to staff? Structure takes over. Okay. So the question is, in light of this, where is your church? So if you take this handout and turn with me, please, to page 6. Page 6. Okay. You'll notice the 10 categories on the left on the vertical column are birth through death. The next column over is the vision column. Now, I want you to go down and look at empty nest, because although you have a mission vision frame, right now that's all you have. It hasn't been implemented. It hasn't become part of the life of the church. And at empty nest, if you don't have vision, if it's lost or missing, that loss will affect most systems. We have less money, we have less children, we have less new people, whatever, okay? And the reason I'm suggesting empty nest is I want you to see what the rest of the categories are. If you look at relationships, it's happening but not keeping up. You have more people, you have people coming. There's still new people coming to the church, but you've got more people going out the back door than you have coming to the church. So as the church has gone from about 460 in 2014, 2015, down to where it is now, you still have new people here, but you just have more people who are leaving for whatever reason. And by the way, in an area where you live, in this kind of an area, 10% of the population turns over every year anyway. Okay, so that means you've got to bring in, if you're running 400, you got to bring in 40 people every year just to stay even at that point. Ministry. Beginning disintegration, we try harder. Now, you may go up to, in this case, if you go up to maturity, high quality and quantity, community known. I'm not sure it's community known, but at least you've had worship services that you're to. The choir, had the great concert at the end of last year. On the other hand, you're saying, what are we going to do with children? And, did that person go half time? There's some issues there. The structure is the focus of the organization. I would say, as I've listened to people talk, did the committee decide this? Did the session decide this? Why didn't we hear about it? People are asking all these kinds of structure questions. They're also communication questions, but they're asking that. Emotion, denial. Maybe we only got 300 and some, but we're bigger than most of the churches around. Some people have to help them understand that denial is not a river in Egypt. Okay, nostalgia. Oh, if so-and-so would come back. If Pastor so-and-so. I've actually had people, if Dee Dee could just come back. There's nostalgia there, okay? For some, it's turning to anger. In fact, that's why some people have left, because they have gotten angry. In fact, I talked to one couple who left today, and they're so angry, I wasn't even sure what planet they were on. It's just anger. Behaviors, blaming. I've heard a lot of blaming. Everybody's blaming everybody. Old timers blame new people are blaming the old timers, the old people are blaming young people, this is worship cafe, that's not, there are a lot of blaming. Issue is more commitment. If we could just be more committed. Lack of confidence with the leaders. I heard a lot about lack of trust, no organizational integrity, not a lot of confidence with the leaders. There are systems that are not functioning well. There has been severe conflict, but there is at least conflict. And what do you need to do? You need to re-envision, which you have started and done well on. You need to develop new ministries, and you need to diminish structure. Now, here's the point, folks. I believe you're at the stage, if you're down here, the point is not to go back. The point is to start a new life cycle. And I think you're at a golden opportunity now if you want to, and we'll talk about what that will look like tomorrow, you're at a golden opportunity to start a new life cycle. That's why I'm saying I do have hope for Bethel, but it's going to mean the decisions that will produce health. Now, anybody have any questions you want to ask about anything we've talked about tonight?
How do you, Dr. Borden, how do you,
By the way, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Does this sound right to you? I want to make sure I'm smoking the right stuff. That's
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, sorry.
you know, with vision and reaching people with the gospel, and talking in conjunction with growth of the church, there are certain things that have been done and can be done that in reality show growth of the kingdom, but not here at Bethel. So how does that, and maybe you're going to, get into that tomorrow, but how does that work together?
Well, I think God designed the church to be the primary way to grow the kingdom. I think the kingdom is bigger than the church. But, I mean, it's interesting that in Acts 1:1-3, for 40 days, Jesus went around talking about the kingdom. So he's saying, this has got to start and it's got to get bigger. But he also says, I will build my church. He expects the church to grow. You look at the book of Acts, everything was about growth. It was about multiplication. Within 300 years, you're 30 million Christians. It's now the number one faith around the world. So I think the point is to say, does Bethel want to be involved in that part of the kingdom? Now, here's what has happened in many churches. Because many churches are not growing, and not growing through both transfer growth but also evangelism growth, the mission of the church has become an individual responsibility. And I do have an individual responsibility to share the gospel, okay? But often for a lot of people, because the corporate is not doing it, then we'll go out and do it ourselves because we want to be obedient to Jesus Christ. But when Jesus talked about being fishers of men, today we'd say fishers of men and women. Fishing is a metaphor. So today when I say to you, we're to be fishers of men and women, what picture comes to mind?
Well, yeah, going out and sharing the gospel.
Yeah, but the metaphor is usually rod and reel fishing.
Yeah.
When Jesus said to the disciples, be fishers of men, what metaphor came? Net fishing. And net fishing you do in a group. And the church has lost the whole concept of how to do net fishing. There's a new book out I highly recommend, and I've got a summary I can send so that you can read the cliff notes of it if you want to, because it's fairly thick. It's called You Found Me, based on some very recent statistics. Only 10% of the churches in the United States are growing by both reaching believers and unbelievers. Only 10%. And it describes the common denominators of those churches. I had the session and the staff at Malibu read it the first month I was there. It's changed the whole way we look at things. But one of the things that they talk about that these churches do, most of these churches are not secret churches. They're not giving the unbeliever what they think the unbeliever wants. But the one thing they do have in common is every Sunday in the way they talk, the behaviors they practice, they honor them as guests. So if you and your wife, get to the point where we can and you have company over, you don't change who you are, but you act differently because you have guests in the house. And so churches have to act differently on Sunday. For example, I'm doing this not only for when we're in in-person services now, because in our virtual service, we were 170 pre-COVID, but we're getting about 1,000 people a week watching what's going on virtually. And I realize many of them are Christians, but there's a bunch that aren't. In fact, we have a 60-some-year-old lady with purple hair that keeps telling me how she's telling her surfer buddies to watch our service, okay? I mean, this is California. And I don't use the word Christian, not because I'm ashamed of the word Christian. I use the word, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm a Christ follower. Now I realize when I preach, you may not be, and that may be something you're pursuing. And I do that to honor the guest as a guest without marginalizing the guest. Okay, and it's interesting that that's what churches do, whether you have a traditional service, whether you have a contemporary service, whether you do jazz or country western, you are still doing it not for the people there, although if it's done well, the people there will love it. You're doing it because you want to honor the guests you hope are there. And Tim Keller says, he found in New York City, when you start to honor guests, it's amazing how God has them show up. So that's really, I think, how you also do kingdom and also do net fishing together. Okay? All right, I said I'd be done at 8:30. It's 8:30. Can I close in prayer? All right, let's pray. Our gracious God, thank you for tonight. I want to thank you for the women and men who are here. I thank you for their love for you, their love for this church, their willingness to spend time as leaders saying, how can we be better? The time they've invested in dealing with the mission and vision frame, the way they have been making decisions to say, we've got to be different. I pray you will honor them. I pray you will bless them. I pray that you will give them courage. I pray that you will give them passion to want to see Bethel be a church that this community looks at to say, boy, there's something different about those disciples of Jesus there, because they not only take care of each other, they're interested in us. May that happen for the sake of those people who don't know you, and may it happen for your honor and your glory. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. See you tomorrow night. Okay. By the way, don't forget to bring your handouts tomorrow night. I'm going to use